Okay, afternoon everyone. My name's Will Wakeling. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at Northeastern, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this, one of the most eagerly anticipated events in this season's Library Meet the Author series. So thank you all for coming. And let me thank the members of the library's Programming and Communications Committee for their work organising this event, and of course we also thank our sponsors, the co-sponsors of this event today, Northeastern's Department of Communication Studies, the Northeastern School of Journalism, and the Northeastern Bookstore, as ever, for their generous support of the programme. If you've not been to one of these events before, let me tell you a little bit about Meet the Author series. It showcases authors whose works address current events and preoccupations, as well as significant social and aesthetic issues, and it brings together faculty, students, staff and friends to debate and discuss these issues. You can support the program, by the way, very practically by becoming a member of the library's supporters group, and if you want to speak to anyone in the library here today, or go to our website, you can find out more about that. Now, we have a really wonderful event today, as I said, welcoming two distinguished co-authors, Bob McChesney and John Nichols, here to talk about their truly timely and important book, The Death and Life of American Journalism. And we're also fortunate to have Professor Dan Kennedy here to introduce our authors. Dan is an assistant professor in the School of Journalism. He's a Northeastern alum. He's an author, a distinguished online columnist with my favorite newspaper, The Guardian, and an avid tweeter. You'll have read him in the Boston Phoenix. You'll have seen him on Beat the Press, on WGBH. His blog, Media Nation, is priceless and covers, as it says, the press, politics, technology, culture, and other passions. So, who better to introduce our meeting with the authors today than Dan Kennedy? Thanks.
Thank you, and what a great turnout today for a couple of terrific authors. I'm really looking forward to this. Bob and John contacted Professor Craig Robertson from the Communications Studies Office and I last fall, and we were immediately excited about the prospect of having a chance to hear them speak here at Northeastern. And Craig has graciously agreed to let me introduce them, so I will proceed to do that. Today we're going to hear from two leading voices of the media reform movement. John Nichols is a progressive journalist who covers Washington for The Nation, has contributed to a wide variety of other publications, and is the author of several books. Bob McChesney, the Gutzell Endowed Professor in the Department of Communications at the University of Illinois, is a leading media scholar and a widely read author. Both are founders of Free Press, headquartered right out here in Western Massachusetts, and dedicated to fighting the good fight for such causes as net neutrality and local ownership of radio and television stations. Back when I was covering the media for the Boston Phoenix, I would check in several times a year with Bob. The hot issue of the day was media concentration, and Bob taught me something important. Overturning time-tested rules that prohibited one corporation from owning multiple radio and television stations across the country was not deregulation, as industry cheerleaders would have it, but simply a different form of regulation. The airwaves can either be regulated for the public interest or for the benefit of private interests. Too often, our lobbyist-fueled government has fueled the latter. Now Bob and John have written an important new book that similarly forces us to rethink our assumptions about the media and the role of government. With the future of journalism threatened by free internet services that have undermined traditional sources of revenue, as well as corporate debt piled up by irresponsible owners and the worst advertising recession since the 1930s, a debate has broken out over whether government ought to have a role. Those who say no argue that the First Amendment and journalism's important as a watchdog on government require that there be a strict separation between government and the news media. Yet John and Bob patiently explain that it has never been thus. From the earliest days of the Republic, journalism has received government subsidies in the form of low postal rates that created an American newspaper and magazine industry more vibrant than any in the world. Today, of course, broadcasters benefit from using publicly owned airwaves with little obligation to fulfill their legally required mandate to serve the public interest. Meanwhile, public radio has largely been privatized, and public television has been starved into near irrelevance. Just as the debate over media concentration should have been properly framed as what kind of regulation, so too should the debate over government subsidies be understood as what kind of subsidies. We already have government subsidies, and we will continue to have them. The question is whether those subsidies should serve us or the media corporations. This all sounds very grim and earnest, but I'm sure we're going to hear a talk that will be as entertaining as it is enlightening. This is my first opportunity to meet Bob personally, but I have met John before, standing outside a church where some sort of rally was being held during the 2004 Democratic National Convention in Boston. I have to confess I don't remember what happened at the rally, but I do remember meeting John. That same year, he published a book about Dick Cheney called Dick, the Man Who Is President. It was hilarious, and for years I kept a promotional button that came with it on my desk. It said, "Impeach Cheney first." I could go on, but let me end here and welcome John Nichols and Bob McChesney.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure whether that introduction is the right one, Dan, and I'll tell you why. Because we didn't do quite as well as we had hoped on impeaching Cheney first. Although I'm still open to the prospect. So first off, I think it's really cool to be introduced by a guy named Will Wakeling, who you had no choice but to go into the library arts in some way because you sound like a Dickens character. Yes, Will Wakeling scrambled out to get the turkey and deliver it to the Cratchits. So thank you very much for inviting us into your literary zone here, and in the basement of the library. And I understand that all of you are here because you are earnestly committed to the perpetuation of a robust and dissenting journalism as the underpinning of a functional democracy, and of course to getting free pizza. And I understand the dynamics well. I hope that we will speak particularly to your concerns, and we'll take a little bit to tell about the book, and then we will take your questions, which always excite us the most, and usually advance the dialogue to that higher level that we have not personally achieved. But let me just say one quick comment on Dan Kennedy. I can't believe any university has given this guy a job. It's astounding. Because in my experience, universities by and large keep people who understand journalism and its relevance to society as far away from possible. You know, they never let them actually teach students. And how many of you here are Dan's students? None. All right, it's working. Yes, all right. Well, I can just suggest to you that if you are looking for good instruction on journalism, there's simply nobody better to teach you. Dan Kennedy is a hero of both Bob and myself. He is one of the ablest commentators on media and politics we know of, and he's just a fabulous, fabulous teacher, fabulous thinker, and so to be introduced by him is a great honor. So, and we're from the Midwest, so we have to teach you, how to do honorifics and things like that. So when I say something really nice about Dan Kennedy, you, of course, as a group, applaud. Proper Boston etiquette here. So, boy, do we have a bummer conversation for you right now. Is there anybody in this room who actually, knowing that none of you are studying with Kennedy, I would assume that is there anybody here who's pondering the idea of going into journalism? Oh, yes, and that's good. Good to have some folks. How hopeful are you about getting a job? Anybody just pop your hand up if you're pretty sure you're going to have good, family-sustaining work. No, the guy's got it's good for you. It's like, that's a good baby. I don't know. Well, what I can tell you is that that Bob and I have come here to with the sole purpose of trying to get you work. And if you follow every instruction that we give you, it may play out right. But we're not going to give you any instructions about how to apply for a job or something like that, because what we're going to tell you is the existing system is falling apart. It's sort of like anybody who's thinking of going into journalism right now has been placed in a car with the pedal put down to about 70 miles an hour and heading straight for a cliff. And happens that our entire media system is about to go off the cliff, and there's a very good chance it will take journalism with it. That's a pretty ugly concept, but I'll start with an example of just how real the crisis is and why everybody here, whether you're going into journalism or not, should be deeply and fundamentally concerned. The Pew Center, which is really, I think, unpleasantly named, but it's PEW, does studies of journalism in communities across this country. And they just did a great big study of something called the media ecology of Baltimore, Maryland. Now, Baltimore is certainly not Boston, but it's actually a pretty functional big American city. They make a TV show called The Wire about it. And Baltimore has one of the great American daily newspapers, a newspaper very equivalent in many, many ways to the Boston Globe. In fact, Baltimore Sun was one of the great regional dailies of the country, just as the Boston Globe once upon a time sent international correspondents around the world because they believed that Bostonians needed their distinct perspective on the world, not just getting it from some other paper like the New York Times. The Baltimore Sun did the same. And just as the Baltimore Sun has now closed all of its foreign bureaus and no longer does cover the world, I think the Boston Globe, I don't know if the Globe has any foreign bureaus still open. They have no foreign bureaus open. And so very equivalent patterns with these great old dailies that are in stunning decline. And in fact, now are relying for sort of a one-size-fits-all take on national and world affairs, not from a Baltimore or a Boston perspective, but from a New York Times or an AP perspective, which by its nature dumbs down and diminishes the perspectives on national and international affairs that might be uniquely of interest to or significance to the community. And so they go into Baltimore, the Pew folks, and they do what always should be done. And in fact, frankly, what we do throughout the book, and that is look at hard data. Don't be romantic about this. The biggest crisis in the dialogue about where journalism and democracy is going is a romantic notion of how we might grab back to what we're losing or leap forward in some sort of fabulous sense to a wonderful 21st century where the internet with all of its tubes will somehow take us someplace special. And they go to the hard data, and this is what they found. They studied where original news stories are generated, where something is, something that would qualify in a broad sense as news comes from in the community. And this was a really robust, rich study where they looked at all of the stories that are done by the newspaper, all of the stories that are done by radio stations, newsrooms, all the stations, all the TV station stories that are done, as well as everything being done online. This incredibly rich, across the board, ecological study of all the online journalism. They looked at the online news sites. They looked at local bloggers. They even looked at Twitter and tweeting by official sources, individuals, all of this to study how do people get the news. And this is where we break the romance. because at the end of their study, where they really went intensively into the city, which has great universities, a great, very engaged populace, all the things that you would want to do. It's actually an ideal place to do it. They found 96% of the news stories in the community, 96% were produced by old media. That's the newspaper, radio, and television. So for all of the chatter, all the bells and whistles about the internet, right, and all of our excitement about it, and I'll tell you, I've been a blogger since 1999. I blogged before the word blog, and have on a daily basis been doing it in a news setting. So I'm much more engaged with the internet than any other form of media. And I love it, and I'm very passionate about it as the future of where we're going. I'll tell you that the internet's not filling any kind of void here. 96% of the original news stories in Baltimore coming from old media. Now, the overwhelming majority, oh, by the way, of the 4% coming from new media, half of them were Twitter feeds from the local police department about folks who got arrested. The police department was twittering saying, we busted a guy. And that was, they were very generous in what they qualified as news. It was very, very broad. But new media just wasn't doing it. So old media was producing the news, particularly the newspaper, the Baltimore Sun. And so I think that now we can adjourn the meeting and go and have more pizza, because we know that it's all cool. Old media is still doing the job, right? It's all fine. Unless you do, and I know as college students at this great august institution, you know you've got to read the whole study, not just the summary at the front. Because when you read into the study, you find out that the Baltimore Sun, which is producing most of the original news in this community still this year, is producing 33% fewer news stories now than it did in 2000, and 73% fewer, 73% less news than it did in 1990. So over the last 20 years, a 73% decline in production of news, original news stories, by old media. So old media is still our primary source of information. It's where the news is being gathered. New media not filling any kind of void, but old media doing dramatically less. And so we find ourselves in a kind of a dire situation. Well, where's the news coming from? What is the source of our information? Because we live in an information society. We are flooded with information. It's coming at us in a constant rate. Where is it coming from? Well, the study actually went that next step, and we do a lot of work on this in our book and looking at this painful reality. There's still information. When old media stops producing, when new media fails to fill the void, information still comes. In this study, they said, well, what are the sources of all the news stories? Where does the story begin of every news story in Baltimore? Well, there's two places where a story can come from in a small d democratic society. One source is from the people, from you. And you go to Dan, and you say, Dan, there's a toxic waste dump over in the corner of the library here. I don't think it's been reported on, and I believe that all the students are going to the basement of the library for these literary events are being horribly poisoned and will soon die. And Dan says, well, you're nuts. And you say, no, come on, take a look, I'll show you. And Dan goes over, starts coughing, and it's pretty obvious that there's a problem here. And he writes about this story, putting his whole academic career in jeopardy because, of course, he's got to speak truth to power, tell the institutional authorities that something's really bad, and force powerful people, using all of his media platforms that he has, to address a crisis that they didn't want to talk about and they didn't want to deal with. The toxic waste dump is cleaned up right before the Nichols and McChesney event. Everyone has a wonderful time. The pizza's great, and humanity is saved. The classic model of journalism is sort of a Woodward and Bernstein thing, only with Dan Kennedy being Bernstein. And so this is great, right? That's what we think of as journalism. That's one way for it to come. That's one way. The other way is for somebody very, very powerful who sits in an office where they don't drink water from a tap. It comes in a bottle, always, and it's a mineral water from France or someplace like that. And they have secretaries and assistants and people who serve them. And they exercise power, be it economic or political, over the rest of us. And they want to set the agenda of what we talk about. They do not want us to talk about the toxic waste in the basement of the library. They want us to talk about why students really want to pay more for their tuition, or something like that. So it's the powerful feeding the story down. So, got our two frameworks here. In Baltimore, this intensive study, they say, where's the information coming from? 86% of the stories, 86% from power. From a CEO, a government official, somebody with a public relations operation going on that wants to feed a story out and begin a dialogue about the issues that concern them. 14% coming from the people. 14% coming up from the mass. Now, you ask yourself, well, that might not be good for democracy. You know, I'm thinking maybe that's not healthy, because that almost sounds like a propaganda state, where the people are disempowered and basically led by the nose through the process. And you think, well, that can't possibly, it must be just Baltimore's a mess, right? I mean, what a lousy town, forget about Baltimore. Except in the book we detail how in 1960 in the United States, there was one public relations person for every journalist. In 1980 in the United States, there was 1.2 public relations people for every journalist. I'd still keep it at a relative ratio there. You know, maybe they're a little more muscular, but a journalist is strong, you can hold them off. There are now, today, 4 public relations people for every 1 journalist in the United States. The fact of the matter is that the propaganda state is on the rise. Journalism, as we know it, is on the decline. It is collapsing before our eyes. Every month in the United States, newspapers lay off more than 1,000 employees. Over the last 2 years, we have lost more than 30,000 newspaper employees in the United States. We talk about newspaper employees because, frankly, we've given up on television and radio. It's not out of disregard for television and radio. We think they're brilliant and wonderful mediums that have great potential. But the fact is that television culled its newsrooms of most of its journalists long ago. They went for weather. And you get a lot, you tune the evening news in tonight, you're going to see a lot of weather, because weather's free. But one weather person up to tell you that it was 50 degrees in Boston and 48 in Cambridge. And all the other details. They'll give you a lot of minutia, but that's all free. It doesn't, there's no controversy. It's not news. It's in fact just telling you what you could find out if you walked out your door. And so television, put it to the side. Radio, since the Telecommunications Act of 1996 allowed one company to own as many stations as it wants, you had an incredible conglomeration of radio. We have lost roughly 20,000 on-air personalities since the 90s. So we talk about newspapers because these are the last great bastions of news gathering. And we're getting rid of 1,000 employees a month, every month. 1,000 a month, every month going out the door. I'm not good at math. That's why I went into journalism. But the American Society of Newspaper Editors tells us that there are 46,000 newsroom employees at America's daily newspapers. Now, if you're losing 1,000 a month, you do the math and figure out how long we've got. We are at an incredibly urgent point. Newspapers are closing, including semi-profitable newspapers. Newspapers that actually make a little bit of money. Last year, 140 newspapers closed in big cities like Seattle, Denver, Albuquerque, Tucson, Ann Arbor, Michigan. All over this country, newspapers are closing down. Boston just had a huge dialogue about whether the Boston Globe would close down. And so we see this crisis coming on, and you're thinking to yourself, well, must be that people have just given up on the news. Nobody cares anymore. That's what, it's got to be the people's fault, because they're dumb and they're disengaged. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There's incredible evidence that people care about the news, but what happened is the news got bought by for-profit corporations, and they started taking, mostly chain ownership, started taking 30, even 40% profits out of communities and sending it off to their investor owners. And then, in a final buying spree, when something had happened in Boston, newspaper companies began buying newspapers that they couldn't afford, paying unbelievable amounts of money and running up huge debts. As advertising started to disappear, disappearing not merely from newspapers, but also not going to news sites on the internet, the revenues started to slow down. With that slowdown in revenues, they were squeezed, and what did they start doing? Kicking journalism to the curb. The commercial media system in this country is giving up on journalism. And that brings us full circle to this propaganda concern. Because the fact of the matter is, the future is not one without information. The future is one in which information will be packaged, will be manipulated, and will be managed in a very attractive way. You'll get all the information you think you can use. The problem is, you won't get all the information that is necessary in a democratic society. I close with the words of James Madison, who wrote the freedom of the press, helped to write the freedom of the press protection into our Constitution. Madison wrote, "A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives." We are at a 1776 moment in the United States. An old system is crumbling. The commercial media system, as we've known it, is falling apart. But there is not a new model, not a new system that is taking its place. It's going to fall to us, to the American people, to intervene, to step in and take the action that will assure that we, the people, have the information that we need about our local, state, national, and international affairs that allows us to be our own governors. The subtitle of our book is "The Media Revolution That Will Begin the World Again." That phrase is borrowed from Tom Paine. Tom Paine's Common Sense of 1776 argued that the people themselves would have to forge a revolution that would give them power. Paine was a journalist. Journalism has always been the underpinning of this American small d democratic experiment. Journalism is in crisis. Journalism is threatened. Journalism is disappearing. But we don't come to talk to you about journalism or newspapers or media. We come to talk to you today about democracy. It is your democracy that is threatened, and it is your involvement that will decide whether we, the people, have the information we need to govern ourselves, or whether we will have the propaganda of the powerful that guides us as they would want to into the discussions and the debates that serve their interests. It is the most vital dialogue of our time. And I invite you now to please welcome Bob McChesney, who at the, I think I brought you down to the bummer moment as deeply as we can. And Bob's job is to bring you back up to the heights of civic engagement and to recognize how we really can begin the world again. Please welcome Bob McChesney.
Thanks, John, and thank everyone here at Northeastern University, home of Reggie Lewis at one time. I want to thank Dan Kennedy for the kind words. I want to thank Craig Robertson. Is anyone here a student of Craig Robertson? What's going on?
This is astounding and good.
You guys don't teach here? I'm going to have to report you to the dean. These guys aren't doing their classes. You know, I'm going to continue to bum you out just one little bit more before we get to the good news, which is the conventional wisdom tells us that as journalism is disintegrating in the United States, as we see Washington bureaus, State House bureaus, foreign bureaus close, that the internet will solve the problem for us, the blogosphere. And I think we demonstrate in the book that while there's tremendous promise of the internet, and it's clearly the future of our journalism, there's no credible evidence yet that it's going to generate the resources to support people to do journalism. And left to its own devices, at the current pattern, we're going to have a journalism that will simply be done on volunteer labor, or by people who are independently wealthy, or people who are spending a lot of time trying to shake down advertising micropayments, but they won't be doing journalism. Any way you slice it, as far as we can tell, it will be a far cry from what will be necessary to support a free society. So what are we going to do? And I think the real crisis we face isn't the crisis in the collapse of journalism. It's the crisis our society faces in understanding how to solve the problem. That's really the great crisis before us. Because there are actually easy ways to solve the problem. how we get to have incredible, independent, uncensored, well-funded journalism that enriches our lives and makes it possible to, as Madison put it, be our own governors, is around us. How to do it is in our history, it's in the world around us, but we ignore it. And we ignore it because basically we're handcuffed in the United States by a few myths. Let me just quickly run by them of what they are. The first myth is that the government should play no role whatsoever in a free press, that any participation by the government, any role by the government is going to be evil and bad and lead to bad things. And the government plays a huge role. It always has from the beginning. So that's false. But still we have that conviction. Government bad, get out of the way. The second conviction is the press is always, in journalism, has always been the domain of business, of businesses seeking profits, and now today of Wall Street. And therefore, if they can't make money doing it, you just don't have journalism. That's the way the cookie crumbles. You know, just roll up the carpet and find a king to take over. And then the third myth that really prohibits us from solving the problem is the notion that any government subsidy of journalism, no matter how well intended, will invariably lead to a totalitarian, authoritarian, anti-democratic outcome. Any subsidy of journalism, no matter how it's done, puts you on a road that eventually gets you to Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, or Pol Pot's Cambodia. That is the only place you can go if you start down that treacherous path. Handcuffed by these sort of assumptions, these myths, it's understandable that we feel powerless and depressed by our crisis. We say, what can we possibly do? We just have to pray some rich guys will bail us out, and they clearly don't think they can make money doing this anymore. We're out of luck. And I'm here to tell you that those myths are what we have to get rid of, because they simply don't hold up to historical scrutiny. This is a solvable problem. And the first place to understand journalism is that the way we think of it as a function of Wall Street and the function of the business community entirely is erroneous. It's completely wrong and not historically backed up. The way we should understand journalism, first and foremost, is as a public good. And that's an economist term basically for the sort of undertaking that society desperately needs, but the market can't produce in sufficient quality or quantity, and that people can't use the market to express their desire for the entity, so to generate it through the market. Classic cases of public good include military, public parks, public education, police. These are things left to the market we wouldn't have or we'd have in deplorable quantities. The government has to do it. Our argument is journalism is very much the same way. Classic case of a public good relates to everyone in this room is basic research. Businesses are pretty good at doing research that is applied to make them direct money. They're not interested at all in doing the basic research upon which applied research is based. So for an example of what basic research produced that no private firm would ever do in terms of research, the internet. The internet is a function of public research. No private firm would ever have had any interest in developing that. But for basic research, funded by the government, it made a lot of sense. The reason why we haven't understood our journalism as a public good in the United States for the last century, why we've allowed these myths to grow, is that for the last 100 years it's been commercially viable. It's been funded by advertising. It's just bankrolled between 60 and 100% of all our journalism. So it looked like companies, investors are making a ton of money on it. So clearly the market can produce sufficient quantity, if not quality, of journalism. But now we're in a moment where that era is ending. The 125 years in which advertising put up the lion's share of revenues to support journalism is no longer here. Last year, for the first time in its history, the New York Times earned more money from circulation than it did from advertising. For the first time in its entire history. That's the future for all news media. The reason is, as we go online, advertisers no longer need to be attached to journalism to hit target audiences. That was always purely an opportunistic relationship. Now they've got all sorts of other options. Some of them don't even include media anymore of any kind to get to their commercial ends. And journalism simply doesn't have that much money. Now there will be some commercial journalism. Some of it will be successful, increasingly pitched towards people with lots of money, but not entirely. But it won't be sufficient to meet the needs of our entire society by any stretch of the imagination. And now we're back to the point we were before advertising emerged. And that leads to the logical question, well, if advertising is only 100, 125 years old, is a dominant factor in supporting journalism, how did we do it the first century in American history? You know, because in the first century of American history, we had by far the largest, most robust, most dynamic print media in the world. How the heck did we do it if advertising wasn't playing the bill? What happened then? And that's where I think our book gets at some information and some research that is almost entirely unknown to Americans and unknown to our policymakers and our journalists, which is the real free press tradition of this country. The real free press tradition of America that we have to really embrace to solve the problem has two components. The first component you all know. The first component is the government should not censor or interfere with news media, should not block anyone from doing journalism, which we completely agree. But to most Americans, they think that's the entirety of our free press tradition. And once you do that, that's all you do, and then you hope you get lucky with Wall Street. But in fact, if you look back at our actual tradition, our real history, look at the real Supreme Court decisions on freedom of the press, there's another equally important facet, component of our free press tradition, which is it's the first duty of the government to make sure a free press exists in the first place. Having the promise that you won't censor a free press is a hollow promise if you don't have a free press that exists in the first place. And there was no understanding in the first 75 years of American history that you could just turn it over to rich people and hope they would make money doing journalism. They had no illusion. No one even thought in those terms in the United States for the first century of our history. And in fact, the very same founders and framers, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Jackson, the same people who were the great champions of no censorship by the government were also the major champions and proponents of massive public subsidies to create a free press system in the first place. They didn't see those values as contradictory, rather they saw them as complementary, as necessary to go together. And what the founders did is they instituted enormous postal subsidies, for example. Not just that, but that was the main one. The post office distributed virtually all American newspapers for the first 50 years of American history. That's all the post office did. 95% of its weighted traffic was newspapers. It was the nationalized circulation arm of all American newspapers. And the great debate in American history, starting in 1792, throughout the 19th century, is what are you going to charge newspapers to be mailed? And the range of debate extended from those who wanted them very, very, very heavily subsidized, so maybe 1/10 of what a letter would be charged, to those who wanted absolutely no charge whatsoever for any postage on a newspaper. That was James Madison's position. Madison argued any charge of postage on a newspaper would instantly, the first papers to go out of business would be those papers that were the most dissonant views, those viewpoints that a free society wanted to keep alive and force people to confront. It was anti-democratic to do anything to diminish the flow of ideas. He wanted all postage to be sent for free. That was the range of debate throughout the 19th century between those two positions. And we calculated what the extent of the federal subsidy of journalism was through the postal subsidies and printing subsidies in the first half of the 19th century, and what it would mean in today's economy. And if the federal government subsidized journalism today in the United States to the same extent that it did in the 1840s, the federal government would be paying $30 billion a year to subsidize journalism. $30 billion. We currently spend roughly $400 million on all of public broadcasting at the federal level to give some sense of the difference. Now, some people say, well, that was then, this is now. Okay, those founding fathers, they were almost French, they were so weird. What they did in the first 100 years of America, that doesn't count. You know, that doesn't, in fact, you know, we're real Americans today, but they didn't have football then, they didn't have basketball, they don't count. They didn't have rock and roll. So what we did is we looked around and we looked at what other democratic nations are doing. Maybe we've been looking in the wrong places for these seconds. Maybe we should have been looking at Pol Pot's Cambodia or Idi Amin or Stalin's Russia. Maybe we should have been looking at countries like us, democracies with constitutions and civil liberties and elected governments. Countries like England and Norway and Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands and Finland and Sweden. Countries that sort of very close to us, unlike Pol Pot's Cambodia or Idi Amin's Uganda. And what we found in all those countries today is they have massive public media and journalism subsidies in each and every one of those countries. All of them have public media, broadcasting, radio and TV, and community media, and many of them also have print journalism subsidies to keep alive second, third, and fourth newspapers and communities, so there's a diversity of views. And the total amount of those subsidies in the Western and Northern European countries varies, but if we have the same degree of subsidies as any of those countries in the United States today at the federal level, given our size of our population relative to theirs, we'd be spending between $20 and $35 billion a year nationally to subsidize journalism. That's what other democracies consider the price tag of a free press, and that's what our founders did for the first 75 years. And now that the advertising industry and the capitalist community is jumping ship, they say we can't make money on this thing anymore, that's the price tag we got to be looking at ourselves if we're going to be serious about this problem. Let me just quickly give a little more on those European countries, because it's so fascinating to see what they do. How they do it is different in each one, but what was striking about them was we studied their subsidies of journalism in Northern Europe and Western Europe. was we, of course, like most Americans, said, well, these must be terrible dungeons to live in with all that government support of journalism. These must be propaganda states, darkness. These would be horrible, awful places, Sweden, Denmark, to live. People must be dying to get out of those countries. They must be terrible. So we went to The Economist magazine, a business publication which annually every year ranks the most democratic nations in the world, based upon the most honest governance, the most civil liberties and individual rights, the most citizen involvement in politics, open politics, basic criteria of any political science department. And The Economist magazine is a business publication. It's not a left-wing publication by any stretch. And the countries it ranks every year as the most democratic nations in the world, without exception for the past several years, are the heaviest press subsidizing countries in the world. Finland, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands. The United States is well below them. And then, we're skeptical, so we said, well, probably they do such a good job brainwashing people, they think they're living in a democracy. It's some matrix parallel universe thing going on in Norway. But really, they crowded out the private media telling the truth. They've been forced into the back alleys doing samizdat, trying to survive before they get arrested by the thought police. We really want to work it out. So we went to a group called Freedom House, which is a group that was founded during the Cold War, whose only mission is to judge government censorship of private media. That's its sole function. And every year it ranks every country in the world on how much censorship of private media there is by government. And a free press is the one that has no censorship, no harassment at all of private media. It's the freest press. Any sort of censorship or harassment of private media or control over private media by the government puts it in the unfree press category. Freedom House puts all communist governments in the most unfree press by definition, all dictatorships by definition. It even puts countries that are democratic and that have a free press, relatively speaking, in its unfree press category if the national government is making threatening sounds to the press. Just the mere threat of censorship, like Venezuela, gets put in its most unfree press category. So these guys have very sensitive antennae for any government harassment of private free press. And so we said, what are the countries in the world that have the freest press according to Freedom House? And guess what? And you probably know where this is going if you've followed my argument so far. The 6 freest press systems in the world, according to Freedom House, are just about the 6 heaviest press subsidizing nations in the world. Norway, Finland, Netherlands, Germany, Denmark. You know where the U.S. ranks for free press, according to Freedom House, started here in the U.S.? Tied for 21st. So the point is that you can have enlightened press subsidies that create an uncensored, independent press, real journalism, that also allow private media to flourish alongside it, grow and prosper and rise and thrive. That is a very solvable problem if we understand it. And that's what we have to do. We have to get to the point where we understand that, and then the real debate is the one Dan outlined at the beginning. The real debate is, okay, what are the subsidies that are going to do that? What are going to protect and promote the values that are important? But they're going to give us the resources so everyone in this room who wants to do journalism has a chance to actually do it and thrive at their craft and become good at it and have the resources and support to do the sort of journalism that not only is respected by people in power, but as Madison put it, must be feared by people in power. Without that, we have no defense as a democracy, as a self-governing people. I'll close simply with a few quick ideas of the sort of things we ought to be doing. Put something tangible on the plate here. There are a few things that are shovel-ready. We can do them right away. We don't need to wait 10 or 20 years. Let's ramp up the money for public and community media, both public and community, and college and university media immediately, dramatically. We spend 1/20th, 1/30th what any self-respecting European country does. For years we were told we didn't need public radio and television and community radio and television because the commercial guys do such a bang-up job. Well, now the commercial guys are out the door, we need them. And put that money immediately into hiring journalists to cover their communities. We have community after community that have no journalists. Let's also take that AmeriCorps program for students to go out and teach when they get out of college for a couple of years in underserved areas. Let's have an AmeriCorps program for journalists. Let's take 50,000 kids and send them to work in communities that have no journalists now or neighborhoods that have no journalists. Start doing journalism. We're about to lose a generation of people, including people in this room, who want to do journalism who aren't going to be able to find work. That should be completely unacceptable. We can't allow that to happen. We have to keep it alive, the flame going. Because if we lose you, it's going to be a lot harder for any of you to come back into the game in 10 years. It's simply not acceptable. Let's also start a process to quarterback all our daily newspapers that are in the process of going under to get them transitioned to a post-corporate ownership. It could be cooperative, it could be nonprofit, it could be local, independent, commercial owners. We really like a plan for what's called low profit ownership, which gives you the independence benefits of ownership that allows you to get nonprofit donations and requires the firm to have a public service obligation above a profit obligation in its charter, which has worked successfully in other places. At any rate, we've got to make sure we have the equivalent of newsrooms, like newspapers, alive and thriving in all our cities. And what we've also got to do is have more than one. Because ultimately, we're going to need a journalism with all sorts of niche coverage on the internet for aimed at men 55 to 60, like me, who likes one thing. I can have websites just for me. That's great. But we also need a journalism that newspapers and one-time broadcast journalism strive to do, which is reach out to everyone in the community, find what links all of us, the important issues we all share, where you go where the really important stuff is. And we need multiple versions of those competing, keeping each of them honest. That's what we have to do, and we can do it. It's there for us, but we've got to take the blindfold off. We've got to face up to our real history and the real situation of the world. And if we do, we will solve this problem. And I can tell you as a conclusion that people say, well, that's hopeless in America. You know, everyone's too vegged out watching Jerry Springer or wrestling. They don't care. Politicians are all owned and operated by powerful lobbyists. They won't do anything in the public interest. That's not the case. Well, the second part's true. The first part's not the case. We've discovered people desperately care about this issue everywhere we go. If you talk to people, like, the question you give people is, do you want to raise your taxes, spend a fortune to bail out Rupert Murdoch and these companies that have run journalism into the ground? They're going to say, of course not. That's a stupid idea, and I would too. But if you say, is it important to you to have a credible system of journalism so people in power are monitored and you actually know what's going on and you get a range of informed viewpoints on the issues of the day, are you willing to pay for that? The answer is absolutely. We need that. That's crucial. And that's the legitimate question we need to pose to the American people, and then we'll get a positive response. And we will force people in power to address it, because believe me, they know the crisis is there too. Right now in Washington, it's being examined by the FCC, the FTC, and Congress. They're all investigating it. They can see it around them. And this is the only idea that's going to actually solve it, and that's the direction we have to go. Finally, last note, we have here Mary Ann Petty, who's raised her hand in the back corner. She's a volunteer from Free Press, the group John and I helped co-found, based in Western Mass. It's leading the fight basically on these issues of journalism and also on network neutrality, stopping the phone and cable companies from privatizing the internet so they can cherry pick which websites come through and which ones don't. It's absolutely the battle for the future of the internet and for digital communication in this country, to maintain it open and free as we've known it. And they're going to try to change that this year if they can in Washington. Free Press is leading that fight. We need all hands on deck for this fight. Talk to Mary Ann after the event. She's outside with information on Free Press. We don't want your money, but we do want your labor and your soul, because we're going to need it if we're going to win. Thank you very much. We've got a couple minutes for questions, and then we're going to go outside and talk to anyone who wants to buy one of our
Then we
books.
do want your money.
And then we do want your money. But it will go to a good cause.
But only from your lunch money or your last rent money that you have.
Okay, let's take some questions in the back there.
Hi, I'm a librarian here.
Say it loud so everybody can hear you.
Okay. My name's Rebecca. I'm a librarian here at Northeastern, and the stuff you're talking about free information is very near and dear to librarians' hearts as well. I was just curious, the stuff you're saying sounds great about, yeah, government should subsidize this, and I think maybe you alluded to it right at the end. Where does the money come from to subsidize this?
Well, for starters, I think that we should regard this funding for journalism the way the founders regarded it, the same way we regard other crucial public goods. If we were under a military attack, we wouldn't say, let's appoint a commission to study how much it's going to cost to defend our country, and report back to us in 10 years and tell us what we should do, whether we can afford it. You would fight back, you would defend your country to protect your liberties, and you'd worry about the fine points later. That's something that's fundamental to your existential survival as a nation. Well, that's what's happening with journalism. So that's the first thing. We have to approach it with that urgency. If we no longer have journalism, when we only have public relations being really well spun, and then people desperately trying on their own to survive in this sort of sea of sophisticated propaganda, we've lost. So we can't really allow that. So that's got to be the initial point. And where will the money come from? Well, it's interesting, you go into the military example. We spend roughly $1 trillion with all expenses in our various military doings. And when they want to invade another country or occupy some country, no one says, hey, stop, pal, where's that $100 billion coming from? Or if they want to bail out some bank, it's never stop, pal, until after the fact someone might whine about it. So it's really a question of how important it is. And I'd say, in our belief, it's so central, it should achieve the status that you just have to do it. It's not something, you can't nickel and dime your freedom, or you don't have a society.
Excuse me, you didn't answer a question.
Well, let me, can I
He
go
asked
on?
you how you're going to pay for it.
Can I go on, sir?
Yeah, I wish you would.
Thank you very much. But we do think it's important to actually come up with sources of money, because we think that you want to preserve the money from political tampering, ideally. So, is that better?
Yeah, but where? Are you
Okay.
going to tax people or what?
Well, taxes is one place you could go, for starters. That'd be one thing, and we think actually people wouldn't protest necessarily if presented in those terms. But we think it's consideration. There are also, in the book, we outline specific places where you could get money currently to have an independent fund that would be not controlled by politicians. And we go through like 6 options that are, most of them are already used in one form or another. So,
Let me just offer one quick notion on this too, because I cover politics for a living, and I know it's hard to imagine where money comes from. We are told we're broke and that we can't possibly do anything except fund bank bailouts and wars. And the figure that Bob threw around of $30 billion seems like a lot of money. It is, and it is a huge amount of money. It is 3% of the bank bailout. And it's what we spent in Iraq in 12 weeks. And so, you know, it's a monstrous amount of money. But this is really a political fight. And I think that the gentleman here gets exactly, where are you? You know, how do you, it's not a matter of where you're going to get the money. It's a matter of whether you can get people to want to spend the money, right? Because this is, you know, we spend money on a lot of things because we think there's some sort of popular will for it. And what we can tell you is this, that this discourse is still very, very weak in Washington. We've had a wonderful response from some members of the FCC. One member read our book over the first weekend after it was published and called us and said, you know, well, how can we start moving on this? What can we do? We've had members of Congress talk about it. I testified last spring before the House Judiciary Committee. So there is an engagement there, but we're not going to lie to you and tell you that this is coming from Washington, and that's great. It shouldn't. What we will tell you is that on this tour, we've been out for a couple weeks, and we've been blown away. We have yet to walk into a room that hasn't been filled. And not just on college campuses, although we love college campuses, but also in community centers. We were in one on Thursday night, and we've been in town halls and in church basements. And the fact of the matter is, people come out in great numbers. They want to talk about this. They want to be engaged in this dialogue. And the answer to your question really is, we will have the money for this. It'll be easy if we have a great mass of Americans who are saying this is an absolutely essential struggle, and if they understand it as such. And we believe that's a long-term struggle, but moments of crisis are always the great moments of opportunity in America. Payne's book was called The Crisis. And we think that this crisis moment in journalism is so intense that when we started talking about public subsidies a year ago in an article we wrote for The Nation, we were ridiculed and challenged by all sorts of folks. But by the end of the very year in which we started talking about it, top people in journalism, including the Columbia Journalism Review, one of the great kind of institutional voices of the craft, were saying, you know, we may have to start thinking about subsidies. And so we feel that the pendulum is shifting quickly. What we want to make sure, though, and I'll use it finally, that any kind of intervention is not to bail out the journalism that gave us a war in Iraq or a bad bank bailout. We want a better journalism, and we think that that's why people have to be highly engaged in that discourse.
Thank you.
we don't have a,
Bringing that press to us.
well, the question is a great question. And to some extent, the question is, you know, the existing commercial conglomerates that control news media and much else, do they have to be dismantled simultaneously with subsidies to spawn new independent media? And the answer is yes, but not as much as would have been the case 10 years ago. Yes, because some of the mergers being proposed today, and the most striking one you might be familiar with is Comcast, the cable giant, gobbling up NBC. This type of merger is a new type of merger that we've had because it's sort of a combination now, if it goes through, of the internet service provision in the community that Comcast provides with a main content producer to an extent we have not yet really had in the United States. And combined with the attack on network neutrality could lead us to a situation where the digital realm becomes much more like cable television and becomes much more privatized and closed off. So to answer your question as a long answer, yes, battling big mergers into these conglomerates is of the utmost importance on one hand, and that's the case. But on the other hand, so many news media companies are jumping ship and getting out that we don't have it's not the same, it's not like we have a thriving industry we're attacking. We're coming to a void, a vacuum that's being left. We're losing journalists, and we're trying to create something where nothing is existing now anymore. So it's a slightly different fight as well.
One more quick question. I know we're running down time. This gentleman here, yes.
Can you give specifics about how you would provide money to newspapers? I mean, because I think of Chicago with both the Tribune and the Sun-Times, or Boston with the Herald and the Globe. I know where I might want the money to go to, but
yeah. I'm not going to let you decide, sir, as much as I like it. Look, one of the things is that we are not proposing to provide money to existing daily corporate commercial newspapers. We are not. It is not our proposal to have the taxpayer ride in to bail out Rupert Murdoch or the New York Times Company. They created many of their own problems. They have proven themselves in many cases to be incapable of managing these operations. We don't want to give them more money. That's sort of like giving more money to bankers on Wall Street or something like that. And so what we propose is to supercharge the public systems, the public structures. You know, one of the big problems with public TV and public radio is, in a lot of America, people think it's kind of lame. You know, it's doesn't do a lot, doesn't produce a lot of news. Maybe it's got some good classical music, but who listens to classical? And so it's like this horrible situation. But that's a starvation situation where it's been so dramatically underfunded. We fund public media in this country at a rate of $1 for every $30 or $40 that is in other countries. So we want to go in there. We want to go in and get real resources to local community radio and community stations. We want to take platforms that are not for profit, that are low profit, and get resources to them. And we want you in the game, sir. I mean, I know that you would like to give your money to the Globe or the Herald. You know, you get to choose there. We're not gonna put you there at this point, but we would like to think about the notion, something that the economist Dean Baker put forward. And this is longer term. Initially, remember, we're talking a News AmeriCorps, maybe some restructuring of ownership things, but longer term, we'd love the idea of every American getting a voucher, a news voucher, where you could say, as a citizen, I've got $200 worth of money to spend. And this is coming from the government. It's government money, but the government doesn't get to decide where it goes. I'm just, my birthright as a citizen, I've got $200 to spend on sustaining information in this country, and I can direct some of it to a community radio station. I can direct some of it to a not-for-profit magazine or publication, some of it to a website that's doing good coverage. And do I think you, sir, personally are going to direct it to the lousiest, lamest, worst stuff possible? Yes, of course, I know you. But I think that, I don't know if this is your wife, I think she's going to do great. And this is something, a weird concept, not much discussed in America, called democracy, where we put a lot of the power into the hands of the people. And again, what we have found is that when you open this dialogue up, when you say to people, you have the power to shape a media system, it doesn't have to come from the top, it can come from you, that people become far more engaged and far more serious. And instead of saying, I need 7 minutes of weather on the evening news and then some news you can use that will tell me how not to be fat, I might actually like to know how my local government is operating and when I can intervene and make good things happen in my children, my grandchildren's schools, and all these things. People will rise to the occasion. We genuinely believe this because the examples from other countries are so very clear. But to do that, the essential first step is to open up this debate and to say, we are in a moment of crisis, and just as in that initial moment of crisis for the American experiment, when Tom Paine called on patriots to ride into the process, to put down your rake and leave the shop and come forward and stand up for a revolution against the most powerful monarchy in the world, we are saying that the bad conceptions, the misconceptions of our moment, are a monarchy that must be overthrown. We can shape a media, a journalism that will sustain our civic and democratic life into the 21st century. In fact, It's not that we can, it's that we must. Thank you so much for joining us today.